Shabbat Shalom. So this is Refugee Shabbat. This year, for those who did not already know this is HIAS's 6th annual Refugee Shabbat. But HIAS has been in existence as a formally incorporated organization for 120 years. So Refugee Shabbat is a fairly new innovation. Now, this is my first time personally participating in Refugee Shabbat. I know that it is not Adat Shalom's first time participating in Refugee Shabbat, and I've heard a lot about our previous experiences, and so I did some thinking about this time, and I know we all did some thinking together about what we wanted today to be like. So today I'm going to speak during our service about the history of HIAS. We're going to study also some Jewish sources reflecting on the history and development of HIAS. And these resources aren't provided by HIAS specifically. They did provide resources, but I chose to do my own research, and I'll cite the sources that I'm using. And then after our services at Kiddush, we'll have our guest speaker, Pastor Frank Wolf. He'll be introduced by Liz Bar-El, and Pastor Wolf will speak, and Liz will moderate a Q&A as well. So without further ado, we'll get into some history of HIAS. And so I took this. There's a lot of history on their website, so I'm just going to speak about some of it. So HIAS was originally set up by Jews to help fellow Jews. By the time Ellis Island became the official immigration, inspection, and processing station in New York City in 1892, HIAS predecessor organizations had already begun providing meals, transportation, and jobs to members of the fast-growing Russian Jewish population. They established a shelter with a dormitory space, a soup kitchen, and they provided clothing for any needy Jew. Organizers also set up a bureau on Ellis Island in 1904 to assist new arrivals, providing translation services, guiding immigrants through medical screenings, arguing before boards of special inquiry to prevent deportations, and obtaining bonds to guarantee employable status. The organization also found relatives for immigrants who were detained because they had no money and they had no friends to claim them. And so this group became famous worldwide and in many languages as HIAS, a short version of its official name, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. The outbreak of World War I brought the largest influx of Jews from Eastern Europe yet. More than 138,000 arrived in the United States in just 1914. And so starting in the 1920s through World War II, HIAS worked through its European arm principally to help 250 Jews to escape Nazi persecution. Now, after the war, HIAS was instrumental in evacuating the displaced persons camps in Europe and aiding in the resettlement of 150,000 people to the US, Canada, Australia, South America, and eventually to Israel. So now, after World War II, there was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and also the 1951 Refugee Convention. These policies became the basis for international refugee law and provided the foundation for HIAS's future work to assist refugees no matter where they were. Now, I thought it was interesting to note that Israel was not part of the UN yet when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was ratified. That was in 1948, and Israel became part of the UN in 1949. Now, Israel did sign on to the 1951 Refugee Convention. Not all parties in the United Nations did so. But still, after this, during the 1950s and the 1960s, HIAS assisted Jews primarily. Those receiving HIAS's support were fleeing such countries as Hungary, Egypt, Cuba, Algeria, Libya, Morocco, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. Now, in the 1970s, things started to shift. In 1975, following the fall of Saigon, the United States State Department requested assistance from HIAS with the resettlement of Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian refugees in the US. Still, of course, HIAS continued to help Jews. In 1977, HIAS helped evacuate the Jews of Ethiopia, and then 2 years later, the Shah of Iran was overthrown, and HIAS began to facilitate the resettlement of thousands of Persian Jews with close family in the US. Now, in the 1990s, HIAS began to expand its resettlement work to help more non-Jewish refugees. At that time, HIAS provided aid and support to non-Jewish refugees from the former Yugoslavia, East Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. In 2002, HIAS established operations in Kenya, and the HIAS Refugee Trust of Kenya was the first HIAS program in decades to focus exclusively on assisting non-Jewish refugees. In 2003, HIAS expanded into the Latin American and Caribbean region, and today, HIAS is one of the leading agencies working to protect displaced people in that region. Now, coming closer to today, with the fall of Kabul in August 2021 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, HIAS rose to two enormous challenges. That's when HIAS also launched a new initiative, Welcome Circles, which many, and I think hopefully all of us in this community are familiar with. As we know, Welcome Circles work with local communities across the US and Europe to resettle Afghan and Ukrainian refugees, to complement the HIAS network consisting of Jewish Family Service and other local partners. And that brings our history to today. So to review, in HIAS's own words, starting in the 1970s and increasingly since then, helping refugees regardless of religion or ethnicity became HIAS's way of doing things, assisting refugees not because the refugees are Jewish, but because HIAS is Jewish. Now today, HIAS is dedicated to helping forcibly displaced people around the world in keeping with the organization's Jewish ethical roots. Okay, so if you're sitting and thinking, what's the Jewish ethical roots piece of this? How do we get from assisting refugees because they are Jewish and so are we, to assisting refugees because they are not Jewish, but we are? So I think this is a good question and a potentially confusing situation. Thankfully, there's Torah that explains this. And so this is from Masechet Baba Kama, but also I found it on My Jewish Learning, which is a great website. So the Talmud reports the following story in Masechet Baba Kama. The Roman government sent two officers to the sages of Israel to learn Torah. So if you're thinking this is kind of a strange situation, what are Romans doing learning Torah? This is a narrative device in the Talmud that's intended to show us, our Jews, readers of the Talmud, how our non-Jewish neighbors perceive us. Okay, so the Roman government sent the two officers. The Romans are learning Torah. They read the Torah. They read it again. Then they read it a third time. And as they left, they said, we've studied all of your Torah very carefully, and we found it to be true, except with this one exception. Here's the situation. Okay, so if a Jew damages a Gentile's property, the Jew has no penalty. But if a Gentile damages a Jew's property, the Gentile has to pay full compensation. The Romans are like, this doesn't make sense, because there's this sentence, this pasuk in the book of Exodus that says, if a man damages his neighbor's property, and it goes on to say the penalty should be the same both ways. So the Romans are looking at this law in the Torah that the penalties for Jews and non-Jews are different. They're looking at this pasuk in the Torah talking about Jews and Jewish neighbors. And the Romans argue if a Gentile can't be a neighbor of a Jew, then a Gentile shall have no penalty. But if a Gentile is a neighbor, then the Jew should pay full compensation. So the situation is either we both pay or neither of us pay. And the deeper question is, are we your neighbor or not? So this story sheds light on our relationships with our non-Jewish neighbors, with non-Jews in the world, and asks the question, what should this relationship be? I think this question affects many of us here today personally because most, perhaps all of us have friends who are not Jewish, and I know that some of us, maybe even most of us, have family members who are not Jewish. So here's a more modern rabbinic story to kind of flesh out what we're thinking about this. This is from Rabbi Natan Levi of the London School for Jewish Studies. He shared an experience that in 2015, he was in a hotel outside Jerusalem with all of these movers and shakers in the community for a conference on Jewish action for the poorest people in the world. And so it was the first day of the conference, and Rabbi Levi is having a problem. He can't find a minyan for prayer. So, a group of less than 10 people is gathering, and he turns to another guy and he says, where are all the Orthodox guys in this conference? And the person responds, the other person waiting for the minyan, says, Aniyeh Yircha Kodmim. So, seems cryptic. So, Aniyeh Yircha Kodmim is a phrase from the Talmud, Masechet Baba Metzia, and it translates as, the poor of one's own town come first. And so it defines this hierarchy in giving, where relatives, You give to your relatives first, and then you give to your neighbors first in your town, and then after that you give to your neighbors in the next town over, and so on until the final rung, which is people who are not Jewish. Now, of course, let's remember, this comes from a society in which it was not normal at that time for Jews and non-Jews to live near one another or to form personal relationships. That just didn't happen in the same way in the times of the Talmud as it does in our society today. So Jewish law seems, from this perspective, to place non-Jews at the bottom of the charity chain. And so that's why Rabbi Levi heard this answer from the other person who was gathering for the minyan. The person thought the type of Jews that would come to make a minyan weren't so focused on the poor non-Jews of the world. Instead, they were focused on the poor people in their own Jewish communities. Okay, so we have this ranking in priority from the Talmud, but are we actually obligated to support the poorest on the planet, even if they are not Jewish? Thankfully, the Talmud is clear on this, and the answer is yes. The answer is yes. We support the non-Jewish poor along with the Jewish poor. We visit the non-Jewish sick along with the Jewish sick, and we bury the non-Jewish dead along with the Jewish dead because of this thing called darchei shalom, ways of peace. So this phrase darchei shalom, it's based on a phrase from Proverbs, but it had profound meaning for the rabbis of the Talmud. It signified a willingness to go beyond the bounds of Torah law in order to achieve a more civil society. Now Rashi, our favorite 12th century commentator on both the Torah and the Talmud, he states that the concept of darchei shalom, when applied to non-Jews, it's a self-defense mechanism, in his opinion. He thinks refusing to care for the non-Jew might lead to increased animosity towards Jews. And this is a concept that's not the same as darchei shalom. It's a different concept called ava. That literally means hatred. It refers to the potential anger of non-Jews if we did refuse to bury non-Jewish dead or refuse to give non-Jews charity. So in Rashi's time, again, the 12th century Europe, the specter of hatred was so real that it overrode the Torah's distinction between non-Jews, Jews and non-Jews in the public domain. So we'll take a step back and remember that as human beings, we're hardwired to help our own first. So we've got to remember, adding our logical reasoning to our primal instincts, we don't have to only help our own. Rabbi Yechiel Michael Epstein wrote, according to Rabbi Levi, even the richest individual is surrounded by so many needy family members that there'll be nothing left to give to the desperately poor in a distant city. So how can the law allow for the distant poor to die of hunger? So it appears to me, says Rabbi Epstein, that we must make sure to give to even the very distant poor. However, those closest to you should continue to receive more than those further away. So it's okay to have a list of priorities, but even the needy at the bottom end of the list of your priorities should still receive something. Rabbi Levi also quotes the then chief rabbi of Israel in the 1970s, Rabbi Yehuda Unterman, on this topic of darchei shalom, the ways of peace. He emphasized that it's not just about good PR. It's not just about making Jews look good to non-Jews. It's about something much deeper than that. Lately, he says, it's become customary amongst our teachers to state that darchei shalom isn't a thing. There isn't really an obligation towards bettering the life of non-Jews. But we have to define the true concept of darchei shalom. It's not just a means to keep Judaism safe from hatred. It flows from the core ethical teachings of the Torah. We have to support all people in the world with tzedakah and kindness. And this is why Refugee Shabbat is Jewish. This is how Hias's assistance of non-Jews is grounded, according to Jewish texts and Jewish law, in Hias's Jewish identity and values. Through our past needs to help our own, we got really good at helping. And obviously today we live in a world alongside non-Jews. For some of us, they are not just our neighbors, they're members of our family. And the Talmud is clear. We are obligated to help both Jews and non-Jews. Rashi's perspective from the 12th century is that we're helping essentially in self-defense. But Rabbi Unterman's perspective from the 20th century is that even since the times of the Talmud, we have been obligated to help non-Jews because doing so is walking the path of peace. So whether your neighbors are Jewish or not, whether your family includes non-Jews or not, whether you believe we should help out of self-defense or because we should walk the path of peace, this Refugee Shabbat is a reminder to all of us that we are obligated to help. We look forward to hearing from Pastor Wolf and to the discussion moderated by Liz Bar-El as we enjoy our Kiddush lunch together after services today. Shabbat Shalom.